It was 6:30 a.m., the middle of a routine, uneventful morning. I was sipping coffee in my cramped office near the city courthouse, trying to focus on a stack of zoning maps, when my phone started buzzing nonstop. 5 missed calls, then a text from my cousin reading, "Emergency, they blocked Aunt Lydia's driveway with a fence. She can't get out." My heart lurched. Aunt Lydia was 84, living alone in a small house in Oakwood Hills, a quiet suburban area known for its meticulously trimmed lawns and hyperactive homeowners association. A fence? Across her driveway? That made zero sense. She'd owned that property for 4 decades. Who would block an elderly woman's only exit? My frustration flared. I chugged the rest of my coffee, grabbed my car keys, and sped out the door. At that moment, I was just a worried nephew. The HOA had no idea I was also the new zoning board president for the county, a role with serious power to stop their antics in their tracks. I arrived at Aunt Lydia's place half an hour later, squealing to a halt when I saw the monstrous chain-link fence that spanned her driveway, sealed by a padlock. One end of it connected to a row of hedges by her property line, the other end angled onto communal HOA grounds, effectively trapping her car behind this metal barricade. My aunt herself stood at the edge of her lawn, leaning on her cane, trembling with both fear and indignation. She glanced up at me with relief. "Thank goodness you're here, Marty," she said, voice quavering. "They put this thing up late last night. My mailbox is on the other side. I can't even drive to the doctor if I need to. I have no idea why they'd do something so cruel." My blood boiled at the sight of her helplessness. I gently wrapped my arm around her shoulders, telling her I'd figure it out, but inside I was seething. I was all too aware of the power certain HOAs wielded, fines over trivialities, harsh rules about mailbox colors. Yet, building a fence that trapped an elderly resident on her own property? That was a new low. My next move was straightforward. Find the HOA's representative and demand an explanation. A small sign in the corner of the lawn read Hawthorne Trails HOA, inquire at the main office. So I hopped back in my car, told Aunt Lydia to stay calm, and drove 3 blocks to a single-story building that served as the HOA headquarters. Stepping inside, I found a bland waiting area and a locked door labeled Staff Only. A scowling receptionist in a crisp blouse sat behind a desk. She barely glanced up, sighing as I approached. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked in a flat monotone. My jaw tightened. "No, but I need to speak to the president or whoever's in charge. This is urgent." She rolled her eyes. "Name?" I forced myself to stay polite. "Martin Quinn. It's about the fence blocking my aunt's driveway on Pineview Street." The receptionist typed something, frowned at her screen, then stood. "Wait here," she commanded, disappearing through the locked door. As I waited, heart pounding, I reminded myself that I couldn't blow up in anger, not yet. My official job gave me an advantage. As zoning board president, I wielded significant authority over local ordinances and compliance. However, I also knew I couldn't just barge in yelling, "I'm your boss, take that fence down." That might sabotage the legal angle I needed to shut them down for good. Within a few minutes, the receptionist returned, gesturing me to follow her. She led me into a small conference room where a stern-looking woman in her 50s sat behind a table stacked with files. The nameplate said Karen Wilkinson, HOA president. She wore a tailored suit, exuded an air of manufactured politeness, and wasted no time greeting me. "Mr. Quinn, I understand there's a concern about a fence. I'll be brief. Ms. Lydia Quinn has repeatedly violated HOA guidelines, ignoring our attempts at resolution. We had no choice but to secure the property line." My eyebrows shot up. Secure the property line? By blocking her driveway? She's an 84-year-old woman who can't even get out for groceries or a doctor's visit now. Karen gave a mirthless smile. "It's unfortunate it came to this, but she refused to comply with community requirements. The fence is an interim measure to ensure no further encroachment." My jaw clenched so hard it ached. Encroachment on what exactly? She's lived there for decades. Karen shrugged, flipping open a file. "Her property layout is in question. We have reason to believe that part of her driveway extends into the HOA's communal garden area. She was formally notified. She failed to respond." "So?" Here we are. The gall of it made my blood boil. Aunt Lydia had never mentioned any dispute about her driveway. She rarely even used half of it, let alone encroached on communal land. Karen's stony expression told me she felt justified, maybe even proud, of punishing a frail senior. "Ma'am," I said, fighting to keep my tone level, "there must be a better way to handle an alleged property line issue. You can't just strand someone on their own lot without due process. Did you seek a court order? Did you consult a surveyor? This is not how property disputes are resolved." Karen's lips thinned. We followed our association's protocols. Miss Quinn ignored multiple warnings. The fence stays until she's prepared to pay the outstanding fines and comply with boundary rules. She closed the file with a snap, clearly done with me. "If you want more details, contact our legal counsel." My heart hammered, but I forced a thin smile. "All right, I see how it is." Then I turned, leaving before I said something that might complicate the bigger plan forming in my mind. Walking outside, I inhaled a deep lungful of warm air, trying to calm the adrenaline. The HOA had thrown down a gauntlet. They believed they could bully Aunt Lydia into paying fines or forcibly modifying her property, but they had no clue about my position, nor about how I could leverage county zoning laws to hold them accountable. For the moment, though, I'd keep that to myself. Instead, I returned to Aunt Lydia's house, gave her a hug, and gently explained I'd found no immediate remedy from the HOA. Her face fell, eyes misting with tears. "I don't have the money they're demanding," she whispered. "They claim I owe thousands in overdue fees. But I never agreed to join any HOA. My house predates the entire association. It's not even inside their official boundary." I nodded grimly. I'd suspected as much. Many older houses in Oakwood Hills had been forcibly incorporated into the new HOA's territory, often with questionable legal tactics. "Don't worry, Aunt Lydia," I said softly, gripping her hand. "We're going to fix this." That afternoon, I tapped into my zoning board resources. I texted my close colleague Charlotte Bailey, the county's top zoning inspector. She responded within minutes. "Sure, let's meet. If they built a fence on private property or misapplied boundary lines, that's a violation." We arranged to see each other first thing in the morning. In the meantime, I made phone calls to a local surveyor and my friend who specialized in real estate law. By evening, I had a growing stack of notes, including the original plat maps for Aunt Lydia's address. As I suspected, her driveway never touched the HOA's communal garden. The boundary line between her property and the HOA was actually a few feet beyond her driveway's edge. If anything, the HOA was encroaching on her land, not the other way around. But forging a direct confrontation that night wouldn't help. The HOA had already shown they'd play dirty, resorting to intimidation. So I began laying out a multi-step plan. Gather definitive evidence that the fence was illegally placed, file an emergency injunction with the local court, and, if necessary, leverage my position as zoning board president to impose fines or sanctions on the HOA for defying codes. Yet something told me the HOA's leadership was cunning. They might claim county officials had given them the green light. My real advantage was surprise. Karen Wilkinson had no idea I was more than a concerned nephew. Her final words in that conference room echoed in my mind. "The fence stays until she's prepared to pay the outstanding fines." But Aunt Lydia owed them nothing if she was never legally part of their association. My anger simmered, fueling me to push forward. Morning broke with a fierce sun blazing overhead. Charlotte Bailey arrived on the scene bright and early, stepping out of her county vehicle wearing a crisp field jacket, an official badge clipped to the pocket. Aunt Lydia greeted her timidly, but Charlotte's friendly smile put her at ease. Together we walked the perimeter of the driveway, measuring the distances from known markers. Charlotte's frown deepened with every measurement. "Well, Marty," she said quietly, "this fence is definitely on your aunt's property. The HOA has zero claim here. They'd need a permit to construct such a barrier anyway, and I'm seeing no record of them applying for one." My chest tightened in triumph. That's exactly what I needed to hear, so they're in direct violation of county codes? Charlotte nodded. Yes, plus a possible trespassing situation. We can issue an immediate stop work order if you like, but the fence is already completed. Usually that requires a removal notice. They'll have a short grace period to comply before we escalate enforcement. I nodded. Let's proceed. By afternoon, Charlotte had filed a formal notice of violation with the county building department, citing the HOA for an unapproved fence structure that blocked a homeowner's access. She also flagged the matter for my desk, given I was the new board president. That alone would cause some internal havoc at the next zoning meeting. Ms. Pierce wouldn't see it coming. Indeed, the next day I scheduled an emergency zoning review to address complaint number ZB7411. My aunt's fence dispute. The board typically convened with 7 members, including me as the new president. Karen Wilkinson might not know I chaired the sessions. She was in for a rude awakening. Sure enough, word spread quickly among zoning board staff that we had a high-profile complaint from a private resident, my aunt, against the HOA. I instructed them to keep my personal connection quiet, wanting Miss Pierce to walk in blind. And that's exactly what happened the following Tuesday morning. We held the review in a small hearing room, a modest crowd in attendance. Miss Pierce arrived in a sharp business suit, flanked by a man in a blazer who introduced himself as the HOA. They both glanced around, expecting some lower-level official to lead the meeting. Then I stepped in from the side door, took my seat at the center of the dais, and cleared my throat. "Good morning, everyone," I announced, focusing on Ms. Pierce's sudden expression of shock. "I'm Martin Quinn, Zoning Board President, and we're here to address complaint ZB741 regarding an illegally erected fence on private property." Ms. Pierce's face reddened instantly. The lawyer jerked his head in confusion. She mouthed, "You," but composed herself quickly, attempting a polite nod. The hearing proceeded in a civil manner, at least on the surface. I recused myself from final voting authority, explaining I had a personal tie to the complainant, but as president I still ran the session and facilitated the evidence review. Charlotte Bailey gave a thorough presentation, with photos, official survey data, and proof the fence stood well within Aunt Lydia's boundary. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue the lines were unclear, but Charlotte's evidence was airtight. The rest of the board members looked unimpressed with the lawyer's evasions. Miss Pierce grew visibly agitated, glancing at me with barely concealed contempt. At one point she muttered, "This is a personal vendetta," loud enough for me to hear. I ignored her, letting the process unfold. Finally, one of the board members turned to Miss Pierce. "Ma'am, can you produce any legitimate documentation that the fence is permitted? Or that Miss Quinn's driveway overlaps HOA land?" Miss Pierce pursed her lips, fiddling with a manila folder before admitting, "We haven't completed the final boundary survey yet. We placed the fence due to her non-compliance with HOA guidelines." The board member frowned. "So you have no legal basis for blocking her driveway?" The lawyer tried to interject, but the board member raised a hand. Miss Pierce simply sat there, face flushed, unable to provide anything substantial. After an hour of back and forth, the board voted unanimously that the fence violated county regulations. They issued a directive ordering the HOA to remove it within 5 business days or face escalating fines. Miss Pierce looked furious, but the lawyer placed a hand on her arm, probably warning her to keep quiet. I glanced at them both calmly. "Since I recused myself from the vote," I said, voice steady, "I'll simply add a note. The faster you comply, the easier this will be for everyone." Ms. Pierce shot me a venomous glare, but bit her tongue. The hearing adjourned. On my way out, I overheard her hissing, "This isn't over," to the lawyer. My only response was a small smile. She was in check. Not quite checkmate, but cornered enough. They had 5 days to tear down that fence. Aunt Lydia was overjoyed when I relayed the outcome. She nearly cried with relief, picturing how soon she'd regain her driveway access. But a nagging worry gnawed at me. Would the HOA actually comply? Something about Miss Pierce's defiance suggested she might dig in deeper. Over the next 2 days, there was no sign of removal. The fence remained locked tight. My aunt needed groceries, so I coaxed her into my car by walking her around the backyard fence. A slow, cumbersome route. The thought that she had to navigate that path just to get out made me boil with anger. We had to accelerate the next step. On day 3, Charlotte Bailey returned to the site, found the fence untouched, and slapped a bright orange notice onto it stating, "Remove by final deadline or face daily fines." Ms. Pierce's brazen disregard risked turning this into a far bigger legal storm, but if that's how she wanted to play, so be it. Sure enough, on day 5, the fence was still there. I drove by early that morning, my stomach clenching at the sight of Aunt Lydia's car sitting idle behind the metal barrier, as if trapped in a cage. The final deadline was 5 p.m. At 5:30, Charlotte rang me. "No compliance," she said flatly. "We have to escalate. The next step is we file an abatement order and the county can forcibly remove the structure. You want me to proceed?" I sighed. Forcing the removal might cause a public scene, but letting Aunt Lydia remain trapped was unconscionable. "Yes," I replied, voice firm. "File the abatement. They chose this path." She promised to handle it in the morning. But that evening something unexpected happened. Aunt Lydia called me in a panic around 7 p.m. "Marty, you won't believe it. There's a crew in HOA uniforms outside my driveway. They're adding more sections to the fence, making it taller." My jaw dropped. "What?" She was nearly in tears. I shouted at them from the window, but they ignored me. "It's like they're doubling down." My blood pounded in my ears. "Stay inside," I told her. "I'm coming over." 20 minutes later, I rolled onto her street to find exactly what she'd described. A group of workers with power tools, extending the fence up by another couple of feet, reinforcing the corners. My aunt watched from behind her screen door, too afraid to confront them directly. I stormed up to the workers, my phone's camera rolling. "Stop this now!" I barked, voice echoing in the twilight. "You're in violation of a county order." One of them, a tired-looking man, shrugged and said, "Boss told us to do it, sorry." Another nodded grimly, said she'd pay triple if we got it done by tonight. My fury reached a boiling point. Miss Pierce was paying these men to openly defy a zoning board directive. She had no idea that she'd just guaranteed a legal meltdown. I told the workers to leave or I'd call the sheriff. They muttered curses but eventually packed up their tools, driving off into the darkness. The fence now loomed even more imposing than before. That night I barely slept, drafting legal notes with Robert, preparing an immediate petition to the county court for contempt charges against the HOA. Miss Pierce wanted a war, she just declared it. By morning, Robert had filed the necessary paperwork, and I'd informed Charlotte that the HOA had escalated the violation. The county sheriff's department also got involved, sending a deputy to photograph the structure. Meanwhile, local news caught wind of the drama. A small van from Channel 6 parked outside Aunt Lydia's yard that afternoon, a reporter interviewing neighbors about the monstrous fence. Aunt Lydia shyly answered a few questions from her porch. She explained how she was stuck, dependent on her nephew for groceries, all because the HOA president claimed she owed back dues. The reporter's outrage was palpable. She concluded the segment with, "Tonight, we'll see if the county steps in to rescue this elderly resident from an overreaching HOA." At last, it seemed Miss Pierce's arrogance had reached a tipping point. On day 7, the judge approved the county's request for forced abatement. That afternoon, a work crew hired by the county arrived with power saws and crowbars, accompanied by 2 deputies. A small crowd of neighbors gathered, some cheering quietly, as the men systematically cut away the chain-link sections and hoisted them off the driveway. Aunt Lydia peeked from a window, tears of relief streaming down her cheeks. Within an hour, the barricade was gone, leaving a battered strip of pavement but a clear path for her car. The sense of victory swelled in my chest. The HOA might have thought they were unstoppable, but they were about to learn they were the ones trapped. Trapped by their own illegal actions and the unstoppable weight of the law. Predictably, Ms. Pierce stormed up in her SUV halfway through the abatement, screeching to a halt. She marched out, shrieking that the workers had no right to destroy HOA property. The sheriff's deputy calmly handed her the court order. She scanned it, face reddening, then turned to me with fury. "You did this," she spat. "You're a traitor to this community." My heart hammered, but I kept my voice level. "I'm the zoning board president, Ms. Pierce. We gave you multiple chances, you refused. Now you face the consequences." Her mouth opened in shock, as though she'd only just grasped the extent of my authority. For the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. The deputy quietly suggested she step back. She stomped to her SUV, glowered at me, and then screeched away. If looks could kill, I'd be 6 feet under. But her threats only fueled my resolve. Over the next week, the local media had a field day with the story. HOA's fence removed by court order. Elderly woman freed, read one headline. The accompanying photo showed Aunt Lydia in front of her newly reclaimed driveway, wearing a timid smile. Another piece highlighted the legal ramifications for the HOA, possible fines for contempt, potential lawsuits for emotional distress. Ms. Pierce avoided reporters, though rumors swirled that her board members were furious at her for dragging them into this fiasco. Some neighbors within the association whispered about removing her from the presidency altogether. Just when I thought the dust might settle, Robert called with an update. Ms. Pierce was trying to levy new fines against Aunt Lydia for bringing negative attention to the community. Another ridiculous angle. Robert predicted it was an intimidation tactic. Meanwhile, I discovered that Ms. Pierce had been pushing through questionable bylaw amendments, effectively trying to absorb older residences like Aunt Lydia's into the HOA. The entire fiasco reeked of a power-hungry executive who believed she could do anything. Enough was enough. It was time for the final blow. I consulted with Charlotte Bailey again, presenting the myriad ways the HOA had violated not just zoning regulations but also property rights. We built a compelling case that Ms. Pierce had misused her position to enforce arbitrary rules on homeowners not legally bound by the association's covenants. On top of that, we found evidence that she'd sidestepped mandatory town notices for fence construction. The county commission scheduled a special hearing to consider revoking the HOA's authority to manage certain areas. A drastic but warranted measure if an HOA repeatedly flouted the law. Ms. Pierce might have fenced in Aunt Lydia, but now the county was prepared to fence in Ms. Pierce's entire operation. On the day of the special hearing, the courthouse bustled with spectators. Word had spread about Ms. Pierce's heavy-handed tactics, and many people wanted to see her face the music. Aunt Lydia sat in the front row, next to me. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes shone with determination. Across the aisle sat Ms. Pierce, flanked by her lawyer, both exuding forced confidence. The hearing opened with testimonies from affected homeowners, including Aunt Lydia, who described how the fence had trapped her at home for more than a week. She recounted her fear, her inability to buy groceries or see her doctor. The panel of county commissioners listened intently, glancing occasionally at Ms. Pierce with disapproval. Another homeowner stepped up, telling a similar story of random fines and intimidation from the HOA. Ms. Pierce's face reddened more with each account. Then it was my turn to speak. I explained how the zoning board tried to address the fence lawfully, how Ms. Pierce defied multiple orders. I ended by revealing I was not just Aunt Lydia's nephew but the newly appointed zoning board president. A ripple of whispers coursed through the spectators. Ms. Pierce's lawyer leapt up, objecting that I was biased. The commission chair overruled the objection, pointing out that I'd recused myself from voting in the local hearing. I calmly laid out how Ms. Pierce's actions violated basic zoning codes, trespassed on private property, and threatened the well-being of an elderly resident. By the time I finished, Ms. Pierce looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. When Ms. Pierce finally got a chance to speak, she stammered about protecting property lines and following the association's best interests, but her defenses crumbled under the weight of documented evidence. The commissioners asked her pointed questions. Why not remove the fence when the order was issued? Why build it higher? Why target an elderly homeowner not bound by the HOA in the first place? Ms. Pierce had no coherent answers. Her lawyer tried to spin a tale of confusion, but the commissioners weren't buying it. The hearing concluded with the commissioners voting to impose steep fines on the HOA for repeated violations, and they reserved the right to strip the association of certain enforcement powers if Ms. Pierce continued to abuse them. It was a resounding blow to her authority. Aunt Lydia squeezed my arm in gratitude as we left the courthouse. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she wore a relieved smile. "Thank you, Marty," she murmured. I never wanted to cause trouble. I just wanted to live in peace. I patted her hand. You did nothing wrong, Aunt Lydia. Ms. Pierce caused her own trouble. Now she's the one who's stuck, not you. Indeed, Ms. Pierce had systematically isolated herself. Her own board members were rumored to be calling for her resignation, seeing her as a liability. Meanwhile, the fines mounting against the HOA threatened to bankrupt them if they didn't revise their approach. And after the fiasco made local headlines, potential new residents likely thought twice about moving into Hawthorne Trails. Miss Pierce was trapped in a quagmire of her own making. Over the next few weeks, Aunt Lydia's driveway stayed blissfully open. No more fences, no more menacing letters. Miss Pierce's power waned as lawsuits from other residents poured in. Some had discovered bogus fines on their ledger and they wanted restitution. The local newspaper published an editorial calling the fiasco a cautionary tale of HOA overreach. I carried on my duties as zoning board president, determined to prevent future outrages. One afternoon, while I was catching up on paperwork, a staff member informed me Ms. Pierce had formally resigned from her HOA presidency. That, combined with the new leadership's promise to treat residents fairly, signaled the end of an ugly chapter in Oakwood Hills. Aunt Lydia recovered from the ordeal, though for weeks she felt anxious stepping outside, half expecting another fence to sprout up overnight. I helped her install a small camera overlooking the driveway for her peace of mind. She resumed her gentle routines, tending her rose bushes, driving to church on Sundays. She beamed whenever we talked about her independence, thankful the nightmare was behind her. Occasionally neighbors would pass by, shaking their heads at how far Miss Pierce had gone. The entire community felt a collective exhale now that the HOA's iron grip had loosened. One early evening, after everything settled, I swung by Aunt Lydia's place with a bag of groceries. She insisted on making tea, so we sat together in her cozy living room. She turned her gaze to me, eyes shining with pride. I never imagined you'd become zoning board president, let alone use that position to save my driveway, she teased, voice trembling with emotion. I chuckled softly. Me neither. Life's funny that way, but I'm glad I was in the right place at the right time. She patted my hand. I know you risked a lot. Your impartiality, your reputation, but I'm so grateful. A warmth filled me. Family first, Aunt Lydia, always. As I left her house that night, I paused in the driveway, remembering how it once was blocked by that towering fence. Now the pavement stretched clear under the moonlight, a symbol of both Aunt Lydia's freedom and Miss Pierce's downfall. I reflected on how fast the tables had turned. The HOA thought they cornered an elderly woman, never suspecting she had a nephew with the legal authority and unwavering resolve to counter their bullying. In the end, they trapped themselves, exposing their cruelty to the entire community. The fence was gone, their leverage dissolved, and Ms. Pierce's reign ended in disgrace. They'd messed with Aunt Lydia. They'd discovered too late that her quiet nephew was the new zoning board president ready to enforce the law. That single brazen act of blocking a driveway sealed their fate. So if they ever considered resurrecting that fence, or pulling another tyrannical stunt, they'd remember how this fiasco ended, with them powerless and publicly humiliated while Aunt Lydia walked free. And that, I thought with a smile, was exactly how justice ought to be done.